I was 31 when I first arrived in Belhaven, Mississippi. Though the years have stripped away the feeling of it, I can still recall the smell of that town, damp oak, wet clay, and something else I could never name, something that clung to the air long after the rain had gone. The church stood on the rise beyond the river road, its spire bent slightly east, as if the wind had humbled it long ago. They said it was the oldest in the county, built before the war and left half burned after it. I remember thinking it looked more like a tomb than a house of prayer. The congregation was small but proud, a dozen families, maybe fewer, all bound by the same weary faith that had outlived their fathers. They welcomed me as if I were salvation itself, shaking my hand, calling me Reverend Clarke, as though the name had been waiting for me before I came. But behind their smiles, I felt a quiet watching, a kind of appraisal that I could not shake. In their eyes I was not a man, but a vessel, something hollow to be filled with their repentance. The parsonage beside the church was a lonely place, one window always fogged, the floorboards uneven and smelling faintly of mildew. At night, when the wind crossed the fields, I could hear the soft creak of the chapel's weather vane turning. I used to pray then, more from habit than belief, asking that God might make something of me. I thought I was chosen for this flock. I thought I was sent to bring them closer to grace. But in those first weeks, there were moments when I felt the opposite, as if the town had chosen me. As if it had been waiting all this time for another soul to keep it company. The older? Women would not speak of the last reverend, though they kept his Bible locked in a drawer in the vestry. When I asked what became of him, they would look to the floor and murmur that he had gone on. The phrase unsettled me. Gone where? None would say. I began my sermons with fire, as I had been taught, words about sin and redemption, about the mercy of Christ and the certainty of damnation. But my voice echoed strangely in that wooden hall. The sound seemed to linger too long, as though the walls themselves were whispering the words back to me. Sometimes I saw people looking not at me, but past me, toward the empty back pew where no one ever sat. It was as though they expected someone else to be there. By the end of the first month I had learned their names, their sorrows, their dead. There was a widow, Mrs. Hensley, who came each Sunday wearing the same faded shawl and never sang the hymns. There was young Samuel, who kept his hat on in prayer, and whose mother's eyes followed him like a shadow. And there was the boy who swept the steps, I can't remember his name now, who asked me one evening if I had heard them yet. I asked what he meant, but he only smiled and went back to his sweeping. It was then that I began to feel something stirring beneath the quiet of Belhaven. Not evil, not yet, but an unease, like a breath drawn in and never released. I would stand at the pulpit and feel the floor shiver under me, as though the church itself were alive, restless. There were nights I dreamed of the congregation standing in silence, their mouths open, no sound coming out. I would wake to find my candle burned low and my throat dry as ash. In those early months I still believed I was doing God's work. I wrote letters home, telling them the Lord had given me a place to build his kingdom again. I never told them about the dreams or the strange way the bell rang by itself on windless nights. I kept those thoughts close, believing that faith meant silence, that doubt was the first crack in the soul. But I see now that was where it began, not in sin but in silence, in the quiet things I chose not to see. I remember the second winter in Belhaven as the season when the church began to turn against itself. The air inside grew colder than the air without, and no fire seemed to warm it. On some mornings I would find frost clinging to the inside of the chapel windows, forming pale veins across the glass, like the hand of something trying to get in, or out. I told myself it was nothing more than damp and neglect, the ordinary decay of old buildings. But decay has its own language, and I was only just beginning to understand it. The congregation still came, though fewer with each passing week. The pews began to empty the way a body does, slowly, piece by piece. They said people were leaving, town for work, for health, for the promise of newer soil further west. But the letters I sent were never answered. It was as if those who left Belhaven simply vanished, their names sinking into the mud and their houses falling silent before the dust even settled. I tried to keep faith in my ministry. Each Sunday, I rang the bell myself, the rope rough in my hand, its pull echoing through my shoulder like a memory I didn't yet have. The sound drifted down the hill and over the fields, and I would watch for figures to appear, small black shapes against the pale morning mist. Some came walking as though half asleep, others already weeping before they reached the doors. They brought me their grief like an offering, and I took it as if I could lift it from them. I thought that was my purpose, to absorb their sorrow, to let it die in me. But the sorrow did not die. It multiplied. I began to feel it moving through the parish like a current, a heaviness that made even the simplest gestures, a hand raised in prayer, a hymn half sung, feel like burdens. There were times I could not remember my own sermons after speaking them. Words came from me that did not feel like mine, and when the service ended, there would be a silence too thick to breathe in. I told myself that exhaustion was natural, that all shepherds grew weary. Still, at night, I would find myself repeating the same phrases under my breath, not prayers, but fragments of something older. It was Mrs. Hensley who first came to me with fear in her eyes. She said her husband's voice had started speaking, again in their house, soft, polite, the way he'd been before the fever took him. She said he called her by name, though the door was locked and the chair where he once sat remained empty. I told her grief plays tricks on the lonely. She nodded, but her eyes did not believe me. A week later, she stopped coming to service. Her door remained barred, and the next month her house was empty. The boy who swept the church said he saw candlelight moving behind her windows for nights afterward. I began to notice things too. The hymnals were never where I left them. The pulpit Bible lay open some mornings, though I was the last to leave and the first to arrive. Once I found the pages turned to the Book of Lamentations, though I had been preaching from Matthew the day before. The verses stared back at me like a wound. He hath filled me with bitterness. He hath made me drunken with wormwood. In those days I prayed not for salvation, but for certainty, that what I was witnessing was simply the erosion of a tired town, and not something deeper, older. But when I closed my eyes, I would see faces in the dark of my mind, faces I could not name, standing behind my congregation, silent, waiting. I remember one Sunday in particular, a fog heavier than any I'd seen rolled down from the hills before service. By the time the first hymn began, it had seeped through the open windows, curling around the pews like a slow-moving tide. The voices faltered, one by one, until only I was left singing. I stopped, and for a moment the only sound was the soft hiss of the fog brushing against the walls. That was when I realized the church had grown quieter than ever before, yet I was not alone. The silence was full, listening, as though the building itself had drawn breath and was waiting for me to speak again. I felt then, for the first time, that I was preaching not to the living, but to something else entirely. And even now I cannot say which frightened me more, the thought that they might still hear me, or the thought that they already had. By the third year the fog no longer came and went. It stayed. It hung over the churchyard like a sickness that refused to lift, seeping through the broken shingles and down the throat of the old bell tower. The air inside the chapel was heavy with damp wood and something else, something faintly metallic like the taste of blood after prayer. The candles guttered no matter how still the air was, and when I spoke, my breath seemed to vanish before my words reached the back pew. It was as if the church itself had begun swallowing sound. The absences continued. Parishioners stopped coming one by one. The miller's wife, the Hensley boy, old Mr. Carraway, who used to lead the psalms with a voice that shook the rafters. Their homes remained, but the windows stayed dark and no mail ever came for them again. I wrote their names in the church ledger, line after line, and found my own handwriting shaking. I remember thinking that this was not the work of God, but of forgetting, as though time itself had grown tired of remembering who we were. I tried to keep order. Each morning I swept the aisle, polished the altar, and opened the shutters to let in the grey light. But no matter how I tended to it, the church began to feel less like a house of God and more like a tomb, not one filled with the dead, but waiting for them. The pews creaked at night, though no one sat in them. Sometimes I would wake to find the bell rope swaying gently, though there was no wind. Once I found a child's shoe beneath the lectern, small, scuffed and damp with mud that smelled of the graveyard soil. No child had come to service in months. I began to dream differently too. In those dreams I stood before the congregation as I always had, but their faces were indistinct, blurs of grey where eyes and mouths should be. When I spoke, they did not respond. They only listened. The longer I spoke, the closer they seemed to draw, as if they were leaning toward the sound rather than the meaning. I would wake with the taste of dust in my mouth and the feeling that the sermon had not ended, only paused. One morning I found a note on the altar, written in a hand not my own. The paper was yellowed and folded neatly, though the ink was fresh. It read only, "You were not meant to stay." I stood there for a long time staring at those words, unable to tell whether they were a warning or a mercy. I locked the doors that night, but when I returned the next morning the note was gone and the doors stood wide open. I told myself I was losing sense, that the solitude had begun to unmoor my reason. I prayed longer, though prayer had long since lost its shape. I tried to hear God in the silence, but all I found was the faint hum of the building's old bones, wood swelling, stone settling, and something breathing faintly in the walls. I began to sense that the church remembered more than I did, that it held the residue of every word ever spoken within it, confession, vow, lie, and grief alike. Then one evening, as I prepared for a service that no one would attend, I saw them. At first I thought the light had tricked me, that the fog outside had caught the last gold of the sunset, and poured it through the stained glass in strange shapes. But as I stepped closer, I realized they were faces, not human in the way we know, but pale impressions pressed against the glass from the outside, as though someone had leaned close to look in. Their features were blurred by condensation, yet I could see their eyes. They were not angry. They were only waiting. That night I could not sleep. I sat in the vestry beside the old baptismal font and tried to remember when the church had last felt alive, when laughter still echoed against the walls, when the bell's call brought warmth instead of dread. The memory would not come. What came instead was the sound of the door creaking open on its own, slow and deliberate. So I did not move. I knew no one was there, yet I could feel the weight of footsteps cross the floorboards, measured, patient, as if retracing steps they had taken long ago. I whispered then, for the first time not to God, but to whatever still lingered, "If you mean to take me, do it gently." The air did not stir, yet I felt the faintest touch upon my shoulder, cold, almost tender, like the hand of something remembering what it once was. And in that moment I understood. The congregation had not vanished. They had simply gone where the church had always belonged, beneath the soil, beneath the silence, still listening, still waiting for my next sermon. When the frost came that winter, it crept through the cracks of the church like a living thing. I remember the way my breath hung before me as I stood at the pulpit, speaking to pews coated in dust and memory. My words were meant for God, but I knew better now. They were for those who stayed behind, those who no longer answered when their names were called. I could feel them then just beyond the light of the candles, listening from the corners where the shadow thickened most. It was in January that the first letter arrived, the only post I received in all that year. The envelope was damp. The ink bled almost entirely away, but I could make out the name written in trembling script. Reverend Clarke. My wife dead for 13 years. I did not open it at once. I placed it on the altar and stared at it through the long grey of that day as though it might open itself and speak the words I feared to hear. By evening I broke the seal, though it had already been broken before. Inside there was only a single scrap of paper, blank but for one line written faintly at the bottom, "You must finish what you began." I carried that letter with me for weeks. I could not recall what it meant or what I had begun. Memory plays tricks in old age, but this felt different, as though something inside me had been intentionally misplaced. The ledger still lay open on my desk, filled with the names of the missing, and each night I found myself tracing the last entry over and over until the ink sank deep into the page. I began to wonder if I had buried them myself, not their bodies, but their remembrance. I had performed so many funerals, I could no longer tell where duty ended and guilt began. The churchyard had grown wild by then. The grass rose to my knees and the stones leaned as though weary from bearing too many names. Sometimes I thought I saw movement among them, not figures but gestures, like the shifting of a memory too fragile to remain still. I told myself it was the wind, though I knew the air was still. One evening, while clearing the weeds from the oldest graves, I found something that should not have been there. A small cross of iron, driven into the earth before an unmarked patch of ground. No name, no date, no sign of who had laid it there. Yet the soil was freshly disturbed, as though something beneath it had been placed or taken. The next Sunday I held service again. No one came, yet I spoke all the same. I read from the Book of Lamentations, though the words trembled as they left my lips. How doth the city sit solitary? That was full of people. My voice broke on that line, because I knew the city was not only Charleston, nor only Mississippi. It was the hollowed shell of my own faith. I had built my life upon the promise of salvation, yet here I was, alone among the ruins of belief, preaching to ghosts who had once believed with me. That night, I dreamed of Eleanor. She was standing in the aisle, her dress the same pale blue she wore the day we buried our child. But her face was turned away from me, and when she finally spoke, it was not her voice I heard. It was the congregation, all of them speaking as one, whispering through her mouth, "You kept the doors closed too long." I awoke with tears on my face and found the church doors standing wide again, letting in the cold morning mist. I did not know then whether the message was rebuke or mercy, but I began to keep the doors open from that day forward, though it invited the chill and the silence alike. In time, I grew used to the presence that lingered, that subtle weight pressing against the air as if the church had taken to breathing beside me. I told myself that as long as I remained within its walls, I could keep them there. My lost congregation, my wife, my son, all bound by prayer and memory. But late at night, when the candles burned low, I began to hear something new, a sound beneath the quiet, like the turning of a page somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. It was then I began to suspect that confession alone would not save me. That what waited in the earth beneath my feet was not the dead, but the truth itself. The truth I had buried the day the church first closed its doors. The days began to lose their shape after that winter. I could not tell when one Sunday ended and another began. The bell had long ceased to ring, its rope frayed to threads that fell like dead vines against the wall, yet I still found myself climbing the narrow stairs each morning, staring at the silent bronze weight that had once called my people to worship. I would touch its rim with my fingertips and feel only cold. No echo, no return. I think it was then I began speaking aloud to the empty air, as if memory might stir sound back into being. I read again the names from my ledger, though I knew most of them by heart. Abigail Shaw, Thomas Finch, Ruth and Peter Hale. Entire families I had married, baptized and buried, all now vanished from every record except mine. Each entry was dated before the church closed its doors, each death marked without a cause. I tried to remember their faces, but my mind returned always to the same Sunday, the one that ended all others, the day the fever came. It began, they said, in the river, in the water that turned brackish overnight. I remember the children crying that it tasted like iron, and by week's end half the parish lay in bed shivering. I prayed then with a desperation I had never known, but when I looked out over the pews that final Sunday, only 13 souls remained to hear me. Eleanor was among them, pale and trembling, her eyes fixed not on me but on the wooden cross above the altar, as if it might answer a question I could not. I finished the sermon in silence. By dusk the fever had taken my wife and child both. After their burial, I shut the church doors myself. I told the few who survived that it was the will of God, that no one should enter until the plague had passed. But the truth which I have carried in my bones these many years is that I did not close those doors to protect them. I closed them because I could no longer bear what lay within. I believed in some small and shameful way that if I sealed the house of God, he would not see what had been done. For weeks I walked the fields, avoiding the churchyard, but its steeple followed me in every reflection, the pond, the windows of my home, even the gleam of my shaving mirror. There was no escaping its gaze. One evening, unable to bear it, I returned and entered through the vestry. The air inside was still and sour, heavy with the smell of mildew and candle wax long since melted away. And there, near the altar, I found the first sign of what I had denied, footprints in the dust, small and bare, leading from pew to pulpit, the size of a child's. I told myself it was imagination, a trick of grief. But the prints appeared again the next morning, cleaner, newer, as though something walked there while I slept. On the third night I stayed awake to see. The moonlight fell through the broken window, and in that thin silver I saw movement by the altar rail, a small figure bent as if in prayer. So I did not move. I did not breathe. And then she turned. It was not Eleanor. It was not even the face of my daughter, as she had been in life. The features were familiar yet wrong, too still, too pale, as if carved from something that had forgotten warmth. I tried to speak, but no sound left my throat. She only stared, and I saw then that her mouth did not move when she spoke. The words came from somewhere else, from the rafters, from the earth, from the hollow where my faith used to be. You shut us in. Father, I fell to my knees, clutching the pew for balance, and when I looked again she was gone. Only the dust remained, though the prince had vanished. For the first time, I knew what kind of church I had built. It was not sanctuary. It was not salvation. It was a tomb, and I its keeper. That night I could not pray. The words turned to ash in my mouth. I sat in silence until dawn, watching the light creep across the altar cloth, revealing the stains I had long ignored, brown, spreading, ancient, and too deep to wash away. I began to understand that faith, once buried, does not rest. It festers. It waits beneath the floorboards, beneath the skin, until the day it demands remembrance. And remembrance, I have found, is its own form of damnation. The weeks that followed were a blur of silence and half-light. I no longer slept in my home. For instead I stayed in the rectory beside the church, unable to stray far from the locked doors, as though proximity could atone for the sins they hid. The fever had long passed from the town, yet not a soul returned. The paths that once led to the chapel were overgrown with grass. The wind carried no hymns, only the low groan of the swamp reeds. Still I rang the bell each dawn with my hands alone, though it no longer sounded, and whispered their names one by one, as if calling them back to life. But something had changed within those walls. Each time I crossed the threshold, the air seemed heavier, the dust unsettled. I could feel a presence lingering behind the pews, as if the church itself still breathed through the wood. The candles I lit would flicker low, no matter how tightly I cupped them. And there was the sound, faint, deliberate, like a chair shifting against the floor or fabric brushing past the altar rail. It came most often at dusk, when the last light fell through the stained glass and bled red across the stone. I began to read scripture aloud again, though no one remained to hear it. My voice quavered and echoed back to me from the rafters, hollow and delayed, as if another mouth repeated each line a moment after mine. I told myself it was the wind, but I could not deny that certain words, mercy, forgiveness, resurrection, returned softer than I had spoken them, as if the church no longer wished to hear. One night, as a storm gathered above the river, I lit every candle I could find and stood before the altar to pray. The rain came heavy, and the lightning flashed through the broken panes, casting brief glimpses of the nave in silver light. For an instant I thought I saw them, my parishioners, seated in the pews once more, heads bowed, hands clasped. The vision faded as quickly as it came, leaving me trembling before the empty room. I felt then a sorrow so vast it hollowed me. They had returned perhaps not for me, but because I had never truly let them go. In the days after, I sealed the windows and barred the door again. I told myself it was for protection, but in truth I feared that if the world saw what lingered within, it would not forgive me. I slept beside the altar, waking often to the smell of damp earth, though no rain had fallen. Once I felt the faint impression of fingers brushing my sleeve, the way a child seeks a parent in darkness. My heart leapt to hope, and then to dread. It was Eleanor's voice that broke me. I heard it in the stillness before dawn, a whisper behind the pulpit, speaking my name the way she used to when she was frightened. I rose and turned toward the sound, and though the church was dark, I saw her small outline against the apse, her hair, her dress, the faint tilt of her head. I stepped forward and she took a step back. Another flash of lightning and she was gone. Only the echo of my name remained, fading into the rafters like smoke. I remember kneeling then, hands clasped not in prayer, but in surrender. I begged the silence to take me, to let me see her once more, if only to know that some part of her remained. But the silence gave no answer, only the slow drip of rain through the roof. And in that moment I understood something dreadful. The dead do not haunt out of malice. They haunt because they remember love too well. They return not to punish, but because the living refuse to release them. Since that night I have not heard her again. The air has grown colder, the pews dusted with frost each morning. Yet I cannot leave. To walk away would be to admit that all I have left is guilt. And guilt, unlike faith, does not fade. It settles, heavy as the stone of a grave marker, patient as time. It waits for confession, but confession changes nothing. The church still stands, and I still keep its door locked. Inside, I believe they wait for me, as I once waited for God. Winter came early that year. The river froze before December, the air brittle with the scent of iron and ash. The church roof sagged under the weight of snow, and I could hear the wood groan with each passing night, as if it wished to collapse and bury all that remained. I had grown gaunt, my hands trembling whenever I reached for the lamp. The oil was nearly gone. So was I. I began keeping a journal again, though not for absolution. Each page was a confession written to no one. I wrote of the silence that lingered after prayer, of the footprints that appeared near the altar, though I had not walked there. Once I found a small scrap of cloth caught on the pew, a child's kerchief, embroidered with the initials E.H. I pressed it to my face until the smell of dust and decay turned my stomach. The nights were the worst. The cold crept up from the flagstones and settled in my bones. I would hear the faint creak of the church door, though it was bolted from within. Once I awoke to find the candles lit without memory of striking a flame. Their light flickered low and golden, and in that trembling glow I saw shadows moving, not on the walls but between the aisles, as if figures passed silently among the pews. I dared not move. Days bled into one another. I ate little, prayed less. My reflection in the cracked mirror looked more corpse than man. The eyes hollow, the skin grey and papery. I sometimes wondered if I had already died, and the church simply refused to let me leave. I told myself that faith was endurance, but faith without forgiveness is only torment. Then one night a sound unlike the rest broke through the cold. A faint tapping, deliberate, measured, coming from beneath the floorboards near the altar. I knelt, pressed my ear to the wood, and there it was again. 3 soft knocks as if someone sought entry from below. I whispered Eleanor's name. The knocks ceased. I pried up a loose plank with trembling hands. Beneath the earth was damp and dark. The smell that rose from it was ancient, soil, rot, and something faintly sweet like lilies long dead. My candle flickered, and in that unsteady light I saw the edge of a small wooden box buried shallow. It was no coffin, just a chest the size of a child's cradle. My breath caught as I brushed the dirt away. There was no lock, only a rusted clasp. Inside lay what time had tried to erase: a few yellowed ribbons, a tiny rosary, and a folded piece of parchment stained dark at the corners. I unfolded it carefully. The writing was faint, but I recognized the hand, my own. It was a letter I had written years ago, though I could not recall when. "Forgive me, Father, for what I have done." No signature, no date. Only that single line written in a trembling script. I felt my knees give beneath me. The letter was not a confession. It was a memory buried to be forgotten. And now, unearthed, it breathed again. The air grew colder still, and as I lifted my head I saw her. Eleanor stood at the far end of the aisle, not as a ghost, but as something caught between sleep and sorrow. Her eyes glowed faintly, not with malice but with unbearable knowing. She did not move, nor did I. Between us the candle guttered and died, plunging the church into darkness. When I lit it again, she was gone. But the kerchief remained where she had stood, clean, white, and untouched by time. I did not sleep after that night. I sat in the pews until dawn, my candle spent, the chill sinking deep into the marrow of my bones. The letter lay folded on the altar before me, its ink faint yet alive, as if still bleeding through time. I read it again and again, trying to remember the night it was written, but my mind would not yield. It was as though memory itself recoiled from that moment, guarding it like a wound too deep to reopen. When the morning light crept through the cracked windows, I rose to ring the bell, though there was no one left to summon. The rope felt heavier than it should, and when I pulled, the sound that followed was not a chime but a low broken moan, as if the bell itself wept for the dead. I let it ring once more, and from the distance the echo answered me, faint, hollow, like another church calling back across a graveyard of years. That day, I searched the grounds for anything that might explain what I had found. The earth behind the chapel was soft from melted frost. Beneath the gnarled oak, I saw a faint depression in the soil, the kind that rain alone could not have shaped. I knelt, my fingers tracing the outline, and knew without doubt that something, or someone, rested beneath. I whispered a prayer I no longer believed in, not for salvation but for remembrance. As I dug, I uncovered fragments of what once was holy, shards of stained glass, a broken chalice, and a strand of hair bound with silk. The deeper I went, the more I began to remember, not in words but in sensations. The smell of burning oil, the weight of a body in my arms, the soft, terrified sob of a girl, asking if God forgives all sins. I had answered her yes, though my hands trembled as I said it. I can still feel that tremor now. By dusk the hole was deep enough to reveal the edge of a small coffin, barely large enough for a child. The wood was blackened by damp and time, yet intact. I did not open it, not then. Instead I sat beside it, my breath clouding the air, and felt the years unravel. Every sermon, every prayer, every quiet morning I had lived after that night, all of it built upon this grave. The truth was not waiting to be found. It had been keeping me company all along, As the sun sank behind the pines, the church bell tolled once more, though I had not touched the rope. Its sound rolled through the valley like thunder muffled by distance. I turned toward the chapel and saw the doors swinging open, though no wind stirred. Light flickered within. Not fire, not candle, but something pale and steady, as if the air itself had remembered how to glow. I rose slowly and made my way inside. The pews were empty, but I could hear voices, faint hymns sung in a language I had long forgotten. They came from beneath the floor, from the same hollow where I had found the letter. Each note trembled, weaving through the silence like smoke. I fell to my knees before the altar, whispering their names one by one, the names of every soul who had ever sat in these pews. When I reached Eleanor's, the singing stopped. The air turned still. For a moment I thought the world itself had paused. Then a whisper brushed my ear, not from behind but from within. "It is your turn now, Reverend." I did not move. I could not. The church that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a mouth, wide and waiting. The air grew warm, almost merciful, and I knew that forgiveness would not come from heaven, but from the grave I had sealed with my own silence. That night, the church refused to sleep. I stayed inside until the lamps burned out, their last light trembling over the cracked altar cloth. Every shadow felt alive, not moving but remembering. I could hear the old wood breathing, swelling and settling, as though the building itself had begun to draw air again after years of holding its breath. I sat there with the letter beside me, my hands clasped as if in prayer, though I no longer knew the words to use. Outside, a storm was gathering. Lightning bloomed far off in the pines, and the smell of rain crept in through the gaps in the walls. It was the same scent I remembered from that final service all those years ago, when the storm had come down, and we refused to dismiss the congregation. Eleanor had been there, her head bowed, her hands trembling as she played the organ. The hymn had faltered halfway through, a single wrong note that echoed too long, too pure. I remember turning toward her, and in that instant the lanterns had gone out. What happened after has haunted me longer than breath itself. I remember the screams, short, confused, cut off too soon. I remember shapes moving in the dark, the sound of someone falling against the pews. The church doors slammed shut from the inside. Then silence, deep and absolute. When the light returned, the pews were empty. All but one. Eleanor lay slumped beside the organ, her hands still resting on the keys, the final chord humming low and broken. I told the sheriff it was the storm. I told the bishop it was the devil. But in truth I knew it was neither. It was us, it was me. I had preached that we could cast out sin by will alone, that through confession we might be cleansed. And that night we tried. God help us, we tried. We sealed ourselves inside and begged the Lord to hear us. We spoke every sin aloud, and when the words ran out we began naming each other's. By dawn no one was left willing to speak. I buried what was left with my own hands. I told no one how the earth trembled as I dug, or how the graves seemed to breathe beneath the rain. The bishop came weeks later, looked upon the ruin and said, "Let this ground rest," and so it did, and for 50 years. Until now. Until I felt the pull to return, to dig up what silence had not consumed. The storm outside grew wilder as I sat there, the thunder rolling like something ancient, stirring in its sleep. Rain beat against the roof, and through it I heard the faintest trace of that old hymn, the same broken tune rising again from the floorboards. I looked down and the wood was slick with moisture, though no rain had yet reached within. I thought I saw faces in the reflection, not clear, not whole, but flickering. I rose trembling and stepped toward the altar. The light from the lightning flashed through the windows, and for the briefest instant I saw them all seated once more. Every soul I had buried, dressed in their Sunday best, their eyes open, their mouths unmoving. Eleanor at the organ, her pale fingers waiting for the next note, and then darkness again. My knees gave way. I pressed my forehead to the cold floor and whispered, If you wish to take me now. The church seemed to lean closer, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. I waited for the hand that would drag me down to where they rested, but none came. Only a voice, soft, familiar, sorrowful. Not yet, Thomas. You must finish the sermon. I lifted my head and saw the pulpit lit by a single beam of pale light. Dust spiraled through it like drifting ash. I stood weak and shaking and made my way to it. My Bible lay open, untouched for years, its pages damp and curling. The verse it revealed was one I had never marked. The blood of the righteous cries from the ground. I knew then what I had to do. I had not returned for forgiveness. I had returned for witness. The story must be spoken once wholly, before the church falls silent forever. And so I began to speak again, not as a preacher, but as a man confessing to his own dead. I did not expect my voice to hold as long as it did. Each word came like a breath drawn through dust, trembling and heavy, yet I could not stop. The church listened. The rain slowed. Even the thunder seemed to fall quiet, as though it too waited for my last syllable. I spoke their names one by one. Eleanor first, then Ruth, then Josiah, then the children whose faces I could no longer recall without shame. For each I confessed what I had done, what I had hidden, and how I had allowed their faith to drown in my silence. There was no fire, no miracle, no holy light, only the slow breaking of my own voice, the faint echo of it traveling through the rafters, and the quiet of wood remembering. Somewhere behind me a door creaked open, though I knew every door had long since swollen shut. I turned, and for a moment I saw them as they were. My congregation alive again, standing in stillness, their faces calm, their eyes forgiving. Eleanor stood nearest, her hair pale as candle ash. She looked at me not with anger, but with the sadness of one who understands too much. I never wanted them to follow me, I whispered. I only wanted them to be free, but no one moved. They waited. I understood. They were not here for vengeance. They were waiting for me to step down from the pulpit to take my place among them. My knees trembled as I descended, my hand sliding along the rail worn smooth by 100 Sunday mornings. My breath grew shallow. The air grew colder, and yet it carried a strange peace. As I reached the aisle, they began to fade one by one, dissolving into the dim light like the end of a candle flame. When I reached the front pew, only Eleanor remained. Her eyes followed me as I knelt beside her, the hymn book still resting on the bench where her hands had once lain. I tried to speak her name again, but the sound caught in my throat. She leaned close, not touching, not quite there, and I felt the faintest warmth like sunlight through water. Then she too was gone. The storm outside had passed. Only the steady drip of rain through the roof remained. I lay down where the pulpit's shadow fell, feeling the boards beneath me, the same boards that covered the graves I had dug. My body ached, but there was a lightness to it, a release. I no longer felt alone. I think I began to smile, though no one was there to see. Before my eyes closed, I whispered one last thing, not a prayer, but a truth I had feared all my life. It was never the devil. It was faith left to rot without love. I felt the church breathe once more, a slow exhale, a settling. The wind moved through the cracked windows, carrying with it the scent of rain and soil, the same scent that had filled the air that final night. The sound of the organ returned, faint and distant, playing the last few notes of a hymn I had long forgotten. When the morning came, they would find the doors open. The Bible still upon the pulpit, my coat folded neatly over the pew. They would say the old reverend had gone peacefully at last, that the curse was ended, that the church could rest. But the truth is simpler. I never left. I am part of the wood now, the dust, the faint hum in the floorboards when the wind moves just right. I am still preaching, not to the living, but to the silence itself, until even that grows tired of listening, and if some day a wanderer passes through this town, finds the church half buried in ivy and thyme, and steps inside to rest, they may hear me still. A faint, cracked voice rising from beneath the pews, whispering to no one. Forgive me, Lord, for building a house you never asked to dwell in.